Batya, what's on your radar?
Last week, Chicago voters went to the polls to vote for their mayor in a runoff election that followed the ouster of Mayor Lori Lightfoot after just one term. Lightfoot is the first Chicago mayor to lose re-election since 1983, and many saw her shocking loss as a referendum on rising crime. Crime in Chicago was up by 20% over the last 5 years. Between 2021 and 2022, crime increased by 41%, with theft, carjacking, and homicides all up since 2019. Lightfoot's miserable showing of third place, winning just 17% of the vote, was viewed by many as a reflection of her inability to protect the residents of Chicago, especially its south and west side areas where gang violence is rampant. Chicago's largely white north side, on the other hand, is as safe as it's been in a generation. But the surprises were not over yet. The man who won the runoff last week, Cook County Commissioner Brandon Johnson, ran to the left of Lightfoot in the initial election and initially supported the defund the police platform, though he later recanted. He campaigned on raising taxes to support mental health resources, education, and housing, and had the endorsement of Chicago's teachers union. Meanwhile, his competitor, Paul Vallis, also a Democrat, though a moderate one, ran a tough on crime campaign that netted him the endorsement of the police union. And it was he who took first place in the initial election, coming away with 33% of the vote, a massive 13-point lead over Johnson's 20%. But Johnson managed to close that lead and then some, finishing with a 2-point lead of 51% to Vallis's 49%, though it's important to note that just 35% of the city's residents voted in the runoff. Still, it is notable that faced with the choice between a defund the police candidate and one who had the backing of the Chicago Police Department, 1/3 of the voters of a city experiencing the deadliest period in a quarter of a century went for the defund guy. Not just that, Chicago is a deeply segregated city, and the crime is heavily concentrated in poor Black and Hispanic neighborhoods. And irony of ironies, the areas hardest hit by violence voted overwhelmingly for Johnson, as the Chicago Tribune reporter Jake Sheridan pointed out on Twitter. Johnson seems to have gotten many of Lightfoot's voters, particularly her Black voters. A WBEZ analysis of the first round of voting found that the voters who initially picked both Vallis and Johnson over Lightfoot lived in Chicago's safest neighborhoods and were more likely to be, quote, white, college-educated, employed, living in households earning more than $100,000 a year and sending their children to private schools. Johnson kept many of those voters. He did well in the upscale areas like Hyde Park and Logan Square, but voters in Black neighborhoods seem to have played a decisive role in picking Chicago's next mayor. And despite being disproportionately targeted as the victims of violent crime, they went for the guy least likely to target criminals by something like a 27% margin. Polling from March found that 55% of Black Chicagoans favored Johnson, as opposed to just 28% who wanted Vallis. What gives? For starters, 46% of registered Black voters hadn't been contacted by either campaign. Moreover, while 50% of Black voters said reducing crime was the most important issue, 30% listed police reform as the second most important issue for them. The winning message seems to be the one Eric Adams, himself a former cop, successfully ran on to beat two progressives in New York 2 years ago. We have to have zero tolerance for violence, whether it's committed by criminals or by cops. Here to help us unravel further what's the matter with Chicago is Rafael Mangual, head of research for the Policing and Public Safety Initiative at the Manhattan Institute. Thank you so much for joining us, Ralph. It's so great to have you. So I think a lot of progressives are probably looking at this data and scoffing at people like me who say that, progressive policies hurt the people they claim to represent most, and laughing at me and saying, you see, this is what they actually want. They want defund the police. They want, to revert resources from cops and from policing towards, mental health and housing, et cetera, et cetera. Are they right?
Not quite. I think they're partially right insofar as a meaningful number of voters in the precincts most affected by crime did pull the lever for Johnson. It's not clear, however, that they did that on the basis of what he was saying about his approach to crime or public safety or disorder. The other thing that I think a lot of these analyses ignore is probably one of the most important things, and that is the voter turnout numbers. I mean, the maps of who went for which precincts went for Johnson, which precincts went for Vallis, are instructive as far as they go. But one of the things that they don't tell us and that they don't show is who actually participated if you're looking at the pool of eligible voters. And the other thing that you find is that in the areas most affected by crime, that is the South and West Side precincts with the highest homicide rates, highest assault rates, those are the areas in which you saw the lowest levels of voter turnout in the city. Looking at levels of between 13 and 20% of eligible voters turning out to participate in that election, compared to upwards of 25 to 35% in some of the other parts of the city on the north side. I do want to correct something though that you said in your lead up to this, which is that yes, north side precincts are generally safe, especially compared to the south and west side. There's no question about that. However, those precincts have seen a really significant increase in serious crime and disorder in parts of the city where that was kind of unheard of not that long ago. I mean, I lived in Chicago from 2012 to 2015. We did not have the number of shootings that you have seen along the Magnificent Mile and in the Gold Coast and on North Rush Street in places where violence was not a very common thing to see. So I do think that the deterioration of order on the subways in Chicago, of order on the streets in some of the more densely populated shopping districts, has certainly shocked the conscience of people who were able to kind of live in their bubbles up until recently, which probably explains the higher level of interest in this race in some of those precincts. But one of the things that I think we have to deal with is that residents living in the South and West Side enclaves that have been struggling with elevated crime levels for a really long time just no longer see these political races, at least the mayoral race, as a meaningful way to address that. I mean, and it's hard to blame them for that view. I mean, for one thing, Kim Foxx had already won re-election, and I think if you're taking a sober look at who actually impacts the situation on the ground with respect to public safety the most, I think there's a good argument to be made that the DA in that district has way more power than the Chicago mayor will. I mean, she gets to decide who gets charged, what they get charged with, what kind of punishments is her office going to pursue. All of these things are going to have a real impact, and that race had already been decided. So it's not crazy to me that other issues ended up overtaking the overall decision for some of the voters living in those districts most affected by crime.
What
Yeah.
what should
Go
be
ahead, Rafa.
done? What has to happen, I get, to connect in voters' mind, the voters who are worried about crime, to connect it to a certain political choice? I mean, yeah, I mean, it's one Democrat or the other Democrat, right? There's a reality in Chicago. There's going to be some level of continuity between the approach to crime and other things. What needs to be, what do advocates need to do to bring voters into the fold in making that issue matter?
Yeah, I mean, as I said in my pre-election piece leading up to the final vote in the runoff, I think this is I kind of predicted that Johnson was going to win, in part because if you looked at the pool of undecided voters, they shared a lot more characteristics with the sort of prototypical Johnson voter than they did with the Vallis voter. And one of the things that I said at the end of that piece was that I think the message here is that folks like me who are relatively skeptical of the criminal justice reform movement need to do a better job of connecting the dots for the everyday voter so that they can better understand, how these policy positions are going to ultimately impact crime on the ground. Yeah, that's a really hard thing to do. It's an uphill battle, in part because things are already so bad. I mean, we saw a significant increase in the level of serious violent crime in Chicago over the last couple of years. But we had also seen a really significant spike in 2016 and 2015. And so, when you're talking about parts of the city that have long been home to significantly elevated levels of concentrated violence, I think you're facing an uphill battle when the task is convincing them that, simply participating in an election is going to make a meaningful difference. And so I do think it's on people like me to just continue to make that case and marshal the evidence to connect those dots, because I do think that argument is the winning one. What I don't want to see is for cities like Chicago to have to deteriorate even further before people finally try the thing that they hadn't been willing to try.
What about this question of police reform? I mean, I do think that, Heather McDonald's data is very compelling. She makes that argument that, of course, there are going to be more negative interactions between cops and people if there are just more overall interactions, and there are going to be more overall interactions in an area that's plagued by crime, right? I find that very convincing. At the same time, people who do have these encounters with the cops routinely and do see police reform, right, 30% as the second most important issue. Do you think that should be part of even a tough on crime messaging in order to convince people that it's safe for them to go with the tough on crime candidate?
Absolutely. I mean, I do think that we've kind of reached some points in which the debate about public safety becomes unproductive in the following respect, which is that you draw this binary between people who are quote unquote tough on crime and people who are soft on crime. And one of the things that I try to make clear in, the way that I speak about these issues is that you don't have to, it's not an either or. You can have both and, right? So the idea that we need to be dragnet in our approach to law enforcement, for example, is something that I reject. I've long argued that whether we're talking about incarceration or, proactive policing, you can actually be very, very precise, in using those tools more like a scalpel than a hammer, by using data and deploying resources to the places most affected and doing the kind of statistical and social network analyses that will help you to identify who the main drivers of crime are in a given jurisdiction so that you can marshal your resources to going after those people without or at least having minimal effect on the vast majority of the population, which of course is law abiding, even in the most dangerous parts of that city or any city. And so, drawing these bits of nuance out in the debate as it progresses moving forward, I think is going to be really, really important for folks who are on kind of my side of the issue. That is to say, folks who see traditional institutions of law enforcement, police, prosecutors, corrections officials as necessarily playing a central role in any crime fighting plan that is going to have a snowball's chance in Miami of succeeding. And so, yeah, I do think that that's been a problem. But it's a hard problem to fight against, because one of the things that we have to deal with is that in the age of social media, where everyone has a smartphone and where you can make something go viral and around the world in a matter of seconds, you're going to be able to pick out one outrageous incident, for every day of the year. But in a country of 330 some odd million people, that doesn't mean that those things are common, but it's very easy to create that perception. And that's something that I think, folks on our side of the debate have had a really hard time with in terms of pushing back on that. And so, I'm not really sure where things go from here. I do worry about the future of Chicago. I worry about the future of cities like, Philadelphia and Baltimore and Louisville and, lots of the other places in America that are struggling with really vastly deteriorating levels of public safety. What we do about that, I think, is the same answer that we had in the late 1980s and into the mid 1990s, which is continue to make the case, use data, and show and prove, right? I mean, in the parts of the country where these decisions are actually made to go with the tougher approach, the more sane approach, as I like to call it, we have to be able to have a record of success. Why that is because I think the history of the crime decline is no longer as compelling to people, in part because a lot of the people pulling levers in voting booths today just weren't around for that.
Raphael, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Batya, for your radar. More Rising after this.